Okay, I'm going to talk about Beloved chapters 8, 9, and 10. Um, in this chapter, we remember, we're reminded of Beloved bringing back these memories. We talked about that Beloved, when she reappears, she starts to bring back the memories that they have repressed for so long. And so, this chapter 8 opens with Beloved in Denver dancing together and talking. And Beloved tells Denver that she says that she had been in the water and there were tons of people there. Okay, so remember when she showed up, it said a fully grown woman came out of the water. And so we're going to come back to this a little later, I believe in chapter 22. But this idea of where she was, that space where she was in between her death and her reappearance in human form. So we know she was in some dark place with lots of people that had to do with the water. At one point, she says she was under the bridge. And she tells Denver that she's come back for Setha. That's all she wants. And Denver has this sort of possessiveness about Beloved, her sister. But Beloved, all she is interested in Setha. And Denver's a little jealous of that. But as the chapter goes on, they begin to, Beloved says, tell me about how you were made in the boat. And that's the story of her birth. So Denver starts to tell Beloved the story of her birth, which we're hearing for the second time. We heard it once in an earlier chapter, but now we have Denver telling it. And Denver says, she never told me everything. But she begins to tell what she knows. And one of the interesting things in this chapter is as that story is being told, it originally is told from Denver's point of view. She's the one telling it. She's the one putting words to it. But as the chapter progresses, it shifts from Denver telling the story to a narrator, a third-person narrator, stepping in to tell that story. So we see Amy again. Denver tells us that when Setha sees Amy, she doesn't see any meanness in her. And we talked about how Amy echoes a lot of the racism of her day, but at the same time, she shows real kindness to Setha. She takes care of her terrible feet. She dresses the wounds on her back. She makes her shoes. She stays with her through the night, even though she's got a mission of her own. And at one point, Setha says she has the tender-hearted mouth and the fugitive eyes. So Amy Denver is fugitive, just like Setha, and they have that in common. And that perhaps is one of the reasons that Amy extends such kindness to Setha, but because she can relate to her. But at the same time, there's just a goodness in Amy that allows her to take care of Setha out there in the woods. And as this goes on, she helps her to give birth. She does say, and this is an important quote, when she's taking care of Setha's feet and it hurts, she says, "Nothing heals without pain." And that's kind of a foreshadowing sentence because so much of this novel is about healing from the psychological wounds of slavery, but nothing heals without pain. And much of the story is the same as we've heard in the previous chapter. It extends a little bit, but Amy Denver ultimately helps Setha to give birth in the boat. They find a boat along the banks of the river, and she helps her to give birth. And she wraps this baby up in her own skirts. And we see the narrative perspective has shifted, and this is where I first noticed it. It calls them two throwaway people. They're two people who, in the sort of social structure of their society, don't really have much value. Amy is an indentured servant. Setha is a black slave, and so they're really two throwaway people. And then the narrator says, who did something appropriately and well. So these throwaway people, these people that society deems disposable, essentially, bring a new life together, work together in this really intimate moment. And childbirth with midwives as a female ritual, it's a very intimate female ritual. This idea of like husbands being in the delivery room, that's a pretty modern idea. And so these two throwaway people do something appropriately and well. And they bring this new life into the world that Setha names Denver for Amy Denver. Okay, so that's where that chapter ends. And then we go into chapter 9, which covers a fair amount of ground. We've kind of got two things going on in this chapter. We have Setha, Denver, and Beloved going back to the clearing where Baby Suggs used to preach. We have that one storyline. And then we have the other storyline of a continuation of the day that Denver was born and of the escape, Setha's escape. So Baby Suggs, after she went to Cincinnati, was bought out of slavery and went to Cincinnati, she became a preacher. And Setha, she would meet in the clearing. She was an unchurched preacher. So she would meet people from the community in the clearing and she would lead them in her version of a sermon. And Setha remembers those days of being in the clearing with Baby Suggs. And so we get a flashback from Setha's memory of Baby Suggs. And her sermon is really important because her sermon consists of the idea of love your flesh. She says, yonder they do not love your flesh. They don't love your neck, unnoosed and straight. They don't love your hands. Those they'd rather see bound. Those they would rather tie, bind, chop off, and leave empty. Okay, so we've talked about love. Love is risky. There is a risk. Paul D says to Setha in an earlier chapter, risky, very risky for a used-to-be slave woman to love something that much. And then later in this chapter, we hear Ella say, if you were to ask me, don't love nothing, because love is a risk. So she's telling them not to love other people. I mean, not that there's anything wrong with that, but she's telling in her sermon is to love yourself. Love your flesh, love your heart, and your back, and your hands, and your neck. Well, that idea of flesh, when we think about slavery was built on the hatred of flesh, meaning the only thing that differentiated those who became slaves from those who were free was skin color, was just pigmentation. And that flesh was accountable for all of the suffering that the slaves experienced. And she is saying those very things that have caused white people to hate you, slaveholders, not just slaveholders, but cause them to hate you, to abuse you, to own you and exploit you. You got to love those things because nobody else out there is going to love it. You've got to love it. But what we find out is that eventually even Baby Suggs struggles with that message. Because in the final analysis, Baby Suggs, her marrow is tired. The suffering becomes too great and she just retires to her bedroom to ponder color, pink, blue, red, whatever, because she says color never hurt nobody, and finally dies. So even she has trouble remembering that message. But Setha goes out there just to connect with Baby Suggs, who she misses, whose counsel she really wants. And while she's out there, she starts to feel herself being choked. She thinks it's the ghost of Baby Suggs because she asked Baby Suggs to rub her neck like she used to, but And she starts to feel these hands on her neck. And then slowly they start to choke her. And she thinks it's baby Suggs choking her. And Denver says, no, baby Suggs wouldn't do that. But then then Beloved starts to rub her neck. And she realizes that it wasn't baby Suggs. She knew the feel of those hands and it was not baby Suggs. So we're led to believe here. And then Denver says later in the chapter, you did it to Beloved. So we're led to believe here that Beloved is beginning to choke Setha. And Setha even has the clues to that. She knew the feel of the ghost's hands. And she realizes that the hands that were choking her felt like the ghost's hands. But she also recognizes that when Beloved is rubbing her neck after that, there's a similar feel. But she just dismisses all of that. She's starting to get clues, but she's not taking them seriously. So we're led to believe that Beloved has begun to choke Setha. I'm not sure why. We can reconsider that a little later. But the other storyline we have in this is Stampede rescuing Setha on the banks of the Ohio River at the end of her escape. And Denver has said in the previous chapter, Denver says, she never told me everything. Well, perhaps this is the part that Setha has never told Denver. So we have a narrator, a third-person narrator telling the story about Stampede. And this is gives us a glimpse into the practice of the Underground Railroad. Stamp was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, and he would ferry people across the river, put them into hiding until somebody else could come rescue them. And this was the whole system that participants in the Underground Railroad used to rescue these slaves. And at this time, it would have been illegal for them to do so. But they do so anyway because they see the people in need. So he rescues her and puts her in a shack until Ella can come and knots some fabric on the post so that Ella would know that there had been a crossing and that they need to come rescue her. And as Setha and Ella talk, Ella listens for the holes, the questions she doesn't ask, the people she doesn't mention. And Setha's afraid to ask if her children made it. And Ella finally says, yes, they made it. And we have the reunion with baby Suggs at her home, where she's reunited with her children for the first time. So we can see one of the things that she says in this chapter is that freeing herself was one thing. Setha says freeing herself was one thing. Claiming ownership of that freed self was something else. So that harkens back to the idea of love. Getting herself out of slavery was one thing. Learning how to love herself, how to claim her freedom, that was going to be a different challenge altogether. We're also told in this chapter, after Denver accuses Beloved of having choked Setha, she says there had been a time, right now her whole life revolves around Beloved, but there had been a time when she'd had a life. I talked about in the review video how literally and figuratively she has been isolated, except for this one period where she went to school, and we hear what that looked like. So she went to school with other children and had a life and had connections until Nelson Lord asked her a question. And the question was, is it true that your mom went to jail for murder? Did you go with her? And she never went back to school after that. And she went home and asked Setha and baby Suggs that question, but she went deaf. She couldn't hear the answer. Now, we're led to believe she literally went deaf. But clearly that's figurative as well. that the answer was going to be so painful.